Boone Carter woke to silence, the kind of silence that screams wrong. Outside his cabin, 200 warriors stood motionless in perfect lines, their faces painted for ceremony, not war paint, something else entirely. They had arrived without sound, without horses, without any trace of how they'd crossed 50 miles of wilderness to reach his isolated mountain home. The strangest part, they weren't looking at his cabin. They were looking at the small grave he dug yesterday behind the oak tree. Fresh dirt, rough wooden cross, nothing more. In the mountains, when natives gather in numbers, people die. That's the rule everyone knows. That's how it always works. But these warriors weren't holding weapons. They were holding flowers. Each man carried a single white blossom. And as Boone watched through his window, the eldest warrior stepped forward and placed his flower on the grave. Then the next, then the next. A ceremony of respect so profound it made Boone's hands shake. Because yesterday he'd buried a stranger, a dying native woman he'd never seen before, who'd collapsed outside his door, speaking words he couldn't understand. He'd simply given her water, made her comfortable, and when she passed, he dug her. A proper grave because it seemed like the right thing to do. Now, 200 of the most feared warriors in the territory were honoring that grave like she'd been their queen. And Boone had no idea who she really was. Boone's rifle hung above the mantel, loaded and ready, but his hands didn't move toward it. Something about the way these men moved. The reverence in their gestures told him this wasn't about violence. Still, his heart hammered against his ribs as he watched the ceremony unfold. Each warrior approached the grave with the same measured steps, the same bowed head, the same careful placement of his white flower. The pile grew into a mountain of blossoms that seemed to glow against the dark earth. The woman had been so frail, so broken when she'd crawled to his doorstep. Her clothes were torn, her breathing shallow, her eyes glazed with fever. She'd whispered something in her native tongue before closing her eyes forever. He'd assumed she was just another casualty of the harsh mountain winter, maybe separated from her tribe during a hunting expedition. But this ceremony suggested something far different. This was the kind of honor reserved for chiefs, for holy women, for leaders whose death shook entire nations. The eldest warrior, distinguished by eagle feathers woven into his gray hair, turned toward Boone's cabin. Their eyes met through the glass window, and the old man nodded once. It wasn't a greeting. It was acknowledgement, recognition of something Boone couldn't comprehend. The warrior raised his hand, palm forward in a gesture of peace, then spoke, a single word in English that carried across the clearing like thunder. "Brother!" The word hit Boone like a physical blow. He'd lived alone in these mountains for 8 years, avoiding human contact, shunning the world that had taken everything from him. He wasn't anybody's brother. He was a hermit, a ghost, a man who'd chosen isolation over the pain of connection. But somehow, by burying one dying woman, he'd become something else entirely. The warrior was walking toward his cabin now, and Boone realized with growing dread that this ceremony was just the beginning. Boone forced himself to step outside, his boots crunching on frost-covered ground. The warrior approaching him moved, with the steady pace of someone who'd walked countless miles, his weathered face marked by decades of sun and wind, behind him. The other warriors remained perfectly still, like statues carved from stone, their eyes fixed on the flower-covered grave. The old man stopped 3 paces from Boone's porch, close enough to speak, but far enough to show respect. Up close, Boone could see the intricate beadwork on his vest, the silver bands circling his arms, the ceremonial paint that marked him as someone of tremendous importance. "You gave her water," the warrior said, his English careful but clear. "You covered her body. You spoke words over her grave." Boone nodded, unsure what response was expected. Seemed right. She was dying. Couldn't just leave her. The warrior's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his eyes. A measuring look as if he was seeing Boone for the first time. My daughter had been lost to us for 6 moons. We searched. Every canyon, every valley, every hidden place where wounded souls go to die. We found nothing. Daughter. The word hit Boone like a slap. He'd buried this man's daughter without knowing, without understanding the magnitude of what he'd done. The woman's face flashed in his memory again. Those fever-bright eyes. The way she'd gripped his hand before letting go forever. I didn't know, Boone said. She couldn't speak, just whispered something I couldn't understand. Ayana, the warrior, said softly. Her name was Ayana. It means eternal blossom. He gestured toward the grave now completely covered in white flowers. She was my only child, the keeper of our sacred stories, the bridge between our people and the spirit world. When she disappeared, our tribe began to die from the inside. Boone felt the weight of accidental responsibility settling on his shoulders, like a stone. He'd simply done what anyone should do for a dying stranger. But somehow, that simple act had connected him to something vast and complex he couldn't begin to understand. She was running, the warrior continued, from soldiers who wanted to force our tribe onto reservation land. She carried with her our most sacred possession, something that could never be allowed to fall into wrong hands. We thought it was lost forever when she vanished. The old man reached into a leather pouch at his belt and withdrew something that made Boone's breath catch. A small silver medallion, ornate and ancient, with symbols etched deep into its surface. You found this with her body? Yes, he asked. But Boone had never seen the medallion before in his life, and if the woman hadn't been carrying it when she died, that meant someone else had been in his cabin while he slept. Boone stared at the medallion in the warrior's weathered palm, his mind racing through possibilities that made no sense. I never saw that before, he said honestly. When I found her, she had nothing but the clothes on her back and a small leather pouch with dried herbs. The warrior's eyes narrowed, studying Boone's face with the intensity of a man who'd spent decades reading truth from lies. Then someone else was here. Someone who knew what they were looking for. A chill ran down Boone's spine that had nothing to do with the mountain air. He thought about his cabin, isolated and defenseless, about how soundly he'd slept after the exhausting work of digging Ayana's grave. Anyone could have slipped inside while he was unconscious, searched through her belongings, taken whatever they wanted. This medallion belonged to my grandfather's grandfather, the warrior continued, his voice heavy with generations of history. It carries the location of our winter burial grounds, places so sacred that revealing them would destroy our people's connection to the land forever. Ayana was carrying it to a safe hiding place when the soldiers found her trail. Boone felt the weight of the situation crushing down on him like an avalanche. He'd stumbled into something far beyond a simple act of kindness. This was about survival, about the destruction of an entire way of life, about secrets that men would kill to possess. Who else knew she was coming this way? Boone asked. The old warrior's expression darkened. Only 3 people knew her route: myself, my brother Dakota, and the army scout who'd been tracking our movements for weeks, a half-breed named Fletcher Knox, who sold his soul for gold coins and army rations. The name hit Boone like a physical blow. Fletcher Knox. He knew that name. Knew the man's reputation for cruelty and betrayal. Knox had been a thorn in the side of every honest settler in the territory. A man who played all sides against each other for profit. If Knox had the medallion, he'd sell the information to the highest bidder without a second thought. Knox has been selling our hunting routes to the army, the warrior continued. They use the information to cut off our food supplies, force us toward the reservation by starvation. But the burial ground's location would give them something even more valuable than hunger. It would give them the power to threaten our ancestors' eternal rest. Boone understood now why 200 warriors had traveled 50 miles to honor Ayanna's grave. She hadn't just died trying to save a piece of metal. She died trying to save her people's souls, and now that sacred information was in the hands of the most dangerous man in the territory. We have perhaps one day before Knox realizes what he possesses, the warrior said grimly. Once he understands the true value of that medallion, he'll auction the information to army commanders who've been searching for leverage over our tribe for years. The warrior stepped closer, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. This is why we came, Boone Carter, not just to honor the dead, but to ask the living for help. The request hung in the air between them like smoke from a dying fire. Boone looked past the old warrior to the 200 men still standing in perfect formation, their presence a testament to how desperate the situation had become. These weren't ordinary tribal members. These were seasoned fighters, men who could track a whisper across stone and strike without warning. Yet here they stood, asking for help from a hermit who hadn't fired his rifle in anger for 8 years. "You want me to go after Fletcher Knox?" Boone said. It wasn't a question. The warrior nodded slowly. "Knox knows these mountains, but you know them better. You've lived here longer than anyone, learned their secrets, their hiding places, and you're white. You can move through army camps, trading posts, settlements where our faces would mean instant death." Boone felt the familiar weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. The same crushing burden that had driven him to these mountains in the first place. He'd come here to escape the violence, the endless cycle of conflict that had already cost him everything he'd ever loved. His wife, his son, his faith in humanity itself, all buried beneath the weight of wars he couldn't stop and battles he couldn't win. "I'm not a fighter anymore," Boone said quietly. "Haven't been for a long time." "Ayanna saw something in you," the warrior replied. "In her final moments, when fever burned away everything except truth, she spoke your name. How could she know your name when you'd never met?" The words hit Boone like ice water. He'd never told the dying woman his name, had barely spoken to her at all except to offer comfort in her final hours. Yet somehow, in her delirium, she'd known who he was. Maybe she heard it somewhere, Boone said, but even as he spoke, he knew it sounded weak. The warrior shook his head. Ayanna had the gift of seeing hearts, of understanding the souls of those she encountered. She saw something in you that even you don't recognize, something that made her trust you with her life, even in death. Behind the warrior, one of the younger men stepped forward and whispered something urgent in their native language. The old man's face went pale beneath his ceremonial paint. He turned back to Boone with eyes filled with fresh fear. "What is it?" Boone asked. "My scouts report army movement 3 valleys east. A full company, maybe 60 soldiers heading this direction. They're being led by someone who knows exactly where to find us." The implications crashed over Boone like an avalanche. Knox hadn't just stolen the medallion. He'd already figured out what it meant and sold the information to the army. But that meant the soldiers weren't just coming for the burial grounds. They were coming for the warriors gathered here for the largest concentration of tribal fighters in decades. And Boone's cabin sat directly in their path. The warrior gripped Boone's shoulder with surprising strength. "They'll be here by tomorrow night, which means we have less time than we thought and far more to lose." In the distance, barely audible, above the mountain wind, came the sound that made Boone's blood turn to ice. The rhythmic drumming of hoofbeats, still miles away, but growing steadily closer. The hoofbeats weren't supposed to arrive until tomorrow. Boone's hands moved to his rifle without conscious thought. 8 years of isolation stripped away in an instant by the approaching thunder of horses. The old warrior barked sharp commands in his native tongue, and the 200 men scattered like smoke, vanishing into the forest with the silence that had brought them here. Within moments, only Boone and the elder remained visible, standing beside Ayana's flower-covered grave like mourners at a normal burial. "Riders coming hard," the warrior said, his voice steady despite the danger. 3 men, maybe 4, moving fast like they're running from something bigger behind them. Boone squinted toward the tree line where dust clouds marked the approaching horses. Something was wrong with the way they rode, desperate and reckless, pushing their mounts beyond safe limits on treacherous mountain paths. These weren't soldiers following orders. These were men fleeing for their lives. The lead rider burst from the forest in a spray of pine needles and scattered stones, his horse lathered with sweat and foam. Boone recognized him immediately. Fletcher Knox, the army scout whose betrayal had set this entire catastrophe in motion. Knox's usually pristine uniform was torn and bloodied, his face marked by fresh cuts that spoke of recent violence. Behind him rode 2 other men, both wearing the blue uniforms of army regulars, their faces pale with terror. Knox hauled his exhausted horse to a stop 20 paces from Boone's cabin, his wild eyes taking in the scene with the paranoid intensity of a hunted animal. His gaze fixed on the flower-covered grave, then snapped to Boone with sudden recognition. "You," Knox gasped, struggling to control his panicked breathing. "You're the hermit, the one who buried the savage woman." The old warrior stepped protectively, closer to Boone, his hand moving to the knife at his belt. Knox noticed the movement and laughed, a sound like breaking glass. One old Indian and a mountain man against what's coming. You have no idea what you've stumbled into. "What's chasing you?" Boone asked, though he dreaded the answer. Knox's eyes darted back toward the forest, where the distant sound of many horses grew steadily louder. "Army patrol found our camp this morning. 60 soldiers led by Colonel Harrison himself. They weren't supposed to arrive until tomorrow, but someone tipped them off about the gathering here." He reached into his jacket and withdrew the silver medallion, holding it up like a trophy. "This little trinket bought me safe passage off the reservation. But now Harrison wants it for himself, wants to use it to flush out every hiding place your people have left." The warrior's face hardened with cold fury. "You sold sacred ground for army gold. I sold information." Knox snarled. "Same as I always do." But Harrison got greedy, decided he didn't need me alive once he had what he wanted, so I took his medallion and ran. The sound of approaching hoofbeats grew thunderous now, close enough to count individual horses. Too many horses, far too many. Knox's face went ashen as he realized the same thing Boone had already understood. The army hadn't just sent a patrol after Knox. They'd sent the entire company, and they were almost here. The first army scouts emerged from the tree line like ghosts, materializing from morning mist. Boone counted at least a dozen men spread across the ridge, their rifles glinting in the afternoon sun as they established firing positions with military precision. Behind them, the main column would be forming up, preparing for whatever orders Colonel Harrison had given them. Knox wheeled his horse around desperately, seeking an escape route that didn't exist. The narrow mountain clearing offered no cover, no hidden paths, nowhere to run except directly into the waiting guns of trained soldiers. His 2 companions had already dismounted and thrown down their weapons, choosing surrender over certain death. "Give me the medallion," the old warrior said quietly, stepping toward Knox with his hand extended. "Return what you stole, and perhaps we can end this without more blood." Knox clutched the silver disc against his chest like a shield. "You think I'm stupid? The moment I hand this over, Harrison puts a bullet in my head for stealing from him. This is the only thing keeping me alive." Boone studied the tree line, noting the positions of the scouts, calculating angles and distances with skills he'd hoped never to use again. 8 years of peace had dulled his edge, but the instincts remained, carved into his bones by too many battles and too many forgotten wars. The old warrior noticed his tactical assessment and nodded with grim understanding. "You were a soldier once, a good one, judging by how you read the field." "Long time ago," Boone replied. "Different war, different uniform. Doesn't matter now, but it did matter. And they both knew it. The reason Ayanna had known his name, the reason she'd trusted him in her final moments, wasn't divine insight or mystical vision. It was simple recognition. She'd seen his face before, probably on wanted posters or army reports from years past. Boone Carter, former Union cavalry officer. Boone Carter, who'd led the raid that freed 200 captured tribal members from an illegal detention camp. Boone Carter, who'd resigned his commission rather than follow orders to relocate peaceful tribes to barren reservation land. The Army had branded him a traitor and sympathizer. The tribes had called him friend. A bugle call echoed across the clearing, sharp, and commanding, the universal signal for parley, for negotiation before violence. Colonel Harrison was offering one chance for peaceful resolution before ordering his men to open fire. Knox laughed bitterly. "Peaceful resolution, right? Harrison's idea of negotiation is deciding which of us dies first." The old warrior looked at Boone with eyes that held generations of sorrow and hope in equal measure. "My people are hidden in these mountains, but not well enough to escape 60 soldiers who know where to look. If Harrison gets that medallion, he'll use it to hunt down every sacred place we have left. Our children will have nowhere to bury their dead, nowhere to honor their ancestors." Boone felt the weight of decision settling on his shoulders like a familiar burden. He could surrender Knox and the medallion, hope the army would be satisfied and leave the hidden warriors alone. Or he could fight, knowing that his actions would determine whether an entire people lived free or died slowly on reservation land. From the forest came the sound of boots on stone, dozens of soldiers moving into final position. Whatever choice he made, he had to make it now. Boone stepped forward, his rifle held loosely in his hands but ready for action. The old warrior nodded once, understanding passing between them without words. Whatever came next, they would face it together. "Knox!" Boone called out, his voice carrying the authority of a man who'd commanded troops in battle. "You've got one chance to make this right. Hand over that medallion and surrender to the colonel. Tell him you acted alone, that no one else was involved." Knox's laugh was sharp and desperate, so he can hang me for desertion and theft. "I'd rather take my chances running." "Running where?" Boone gestured toward the surrounding mountains. "You know these peaks better than most. There's nowhere to go from here except down. And Harrison's got the only trail blocked." From the forest came the sound of Colonel Harrison's voice, amplified by a speaking trumpet. "Boone Carter, I know you're out there. I know your history with these people. Stand down and let us take the deserters, and we'll consider your involvement a misunderstanding." The offer hung in the air like smoke from a rifle barrel. Boone could accept it. Step aside. Let the army take Knox and the medallion. It would be the safe choice, the smart choice, but it would also doom the hidden burial grounds to desecration and the warriors' people to spiritual destruction. "Counter. Offer," Colonel Boone shouted back. "Knox returns the medallion to its rightful owners, and you withdraw your troops. Everyone goes home alive." Harrison's laugh carried clearly across the clearing. "You're in no position to negotiate, Carter. You're outnumbered 20-1, outgunned, and harboring army deserters. Surrender now, or face the consequences." Boone looked at the old warrior, seeing generations of his people's struggles reflected in the man's weathered face. These weren't just burial grounds they were fighting to protect. They were the last connection between a dying culture and its ancestors, the final thread holding together a way of life that had survived countless attempts at destruction. The warrior reached into his vest and withdrew something that made Boone's breath catch. A second medallion identical to the one Knox clutched desperately. "Ayanna carried two," the old man said quietly. "The real one, which she hid before her death, and a decoy which she left in her pouch for thieves to find. Knox stared at the genuine medallion in horror, realizing that everything he'd stolen, everything he'd betrayed his oath for, was worthless. The fake medallion in his hands would lead Harrison's troops to empty valleys and abandoned camps, while the real burial grounds remained hidden and safe. "You played us all," Knox whispered. The warrior smiled grimly. "My daughter was wise beyond her years. She knew someone would try to steal our sacred knowledge, so she prepared for betrayal." Colonel Harrison's voice cut through the tension like a blade. "Final warning, Carter. Stand down or we open fire." Boone raised his rifle, sighting down the barrel toward the tree line where Harrison's scouts waited around him. He sensed, rather, then saw the hidden warriors emerging from their concealment. 200 skilled fighters taking position for a battle that would echo through these mountains for generations. "Then let's finish this." Boone said the battle lasted exactly 7 minutes. Colonel Harrison had expected to face one hermit and an old warrior. Instead, his troops found themselves surrounded by 200 seasoned fighters who knew every rock, every tree, every shadow in these mountains. The warriors struck from positions that should have been impossible to reach, appearing and vanishing like morning mist, turning the hunter into the hunted with devastating efficiency. Harrison's men, trained for open battlefield warfare, crumbled under the pressure of mountain combat they'd never experienced. Within minutes, half his force was disarmed and captured, the rest retreating in disorder down the mountain paths they'd climbed so confidently hours before. Colonel Harrison himself lay bound and unconscious near Boone's cabin. His grand plans reduced to military disgrace and certain court-martial. Fletcher Knox had tried to run during the chaos, but 2 warriors caught him before he reached the tree line. They dragged him back to face justice, the fake medallion still clutched uselessly in his trembling hands. The old warrior stood over Knox with the patience of stone, holding the genuine medallion that contained his people's most sacred secrets. "You sold our hunting grounds for gold," he said quietly. "You betrayed trust that took generations to build. But your greatest crime was causing my daughter's death through your greed." Knox whimpered, all his former arrogance stripped away by the reality of absolute defeat. "Please, I was just following orders. I never meant for anyone to die." "Neither did the soldiers who drove our children from their homes," the warrior replied. "Neither did the officials who promised us land and gave us poison. Intent means nothing when the result is death and suffering." The warrior nodded to his men who lifted Knox and began carrying him toward the forest. Boone knew without asking that Fletcher Knox would never threaten anyone again. Justice in these mountains was swift and final, carved from centuries of betrayal and broken promises. As the sun set behind the western peaks, the warriors gathered around Ayanna's grave one final time. Each man placed his hand on the earth above her body, speaking words in their ancient language that seemed to make the very air shimmer with reverence. The old warrior approached Boone as his men prepared to depart, carrying their prisoners and their recovered sacred knowledge back to hidden camps scattered throughout the vast wilderness. "You could come with us," he offered. "Live among people who understand the value of honor, who remember what it means to protect rather than destroy." Boone looked around at his cabin, at the solitary life he'd built in these mountains, at the isolation that had both saved and imprisoned him for 8 years. Then he looked at Ayanna's grave covered in white flowers that would bloom again come spring, and felt something shift inside his chest like ice breaking up after a long winter. "I think I'll stay here," he said. "But maybe I don't need to stay alone." The old warrior smiled, understanding immediately. "The path between our camp and your cabin will always be open. Ayanna saw your heart clearly, Boone Carter. She knew you were meant to be a bridge between worlds, not a man standing on an island." As the warriors disappeared into the forest with the same silence that had brought them, Boone remained beside the grave until full darkness fell. When he finally returned to his cabin, he left the door unlocked for the first time in 8 years. The age of hiding was over. The time for connection had begun.